Oh, I'm supposed to start.
Yeah, Bob is introducing himself.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, I'm Bob Walker. I'm listed here as Robert T. Walker. I'm actually in the department. You may never see me. I spent a lot of time in the Center for Latin American Studies. And today I'm here to talk about a project that was relatively recently funded. So it's going to be a bit of an unusual presentation in that it's very much a work in progress. We don't have any definitive results yet, but we feel that it's a good time to start talking about the project and bringing it to the public. I've been very fortunate in having a very strong team, who most of whom are listed here, at least the co-PIs on the project. It originated as a University of Florida project, but since then there's been a migration out of Florida. Joel Correa is now at Colorado State. As of, I think, November, December, quite recently, and Joel will be talking to us today. He's here via Zoom. Michael Esbach was a student here and finished a couple years ago. He's now at Princeton University doing a postdoc. Cynthia Simmons, of course. Michael Acevedo, who's in wildlife ecology and conservation. And we also have Michael Whalen, who's working on the project as a graduate research assistant. I would like to say at the outset that this project really began in large part because of the work that Michael Esbach had done in the Ecuadorian Amazon. It's quite fantastic. He did his dissertation there, but over the years has developed quite an amazing base of collaborators, and he's made our transition into the Ecuadorian Amazon rather easy and painless. So we're very thankful to him. I don't think he's online today, unfortunately. I don't see his name. But anyway, moving forward, hopefully you saw the title here. That's the title of our NSF project, Resilient Socio-Environmental Systems, Indigenous Territories in the Face of Change. And it was funded under the new program. It was kind of the successor to the Coupled Natural Human Systems program. It's the Dynamics of Integrated Socio-Environmental Systems, or so-called DSIS. So today we will have myself talking, Cynthia Simmons talking, and then Joel talking over Zoom. But to start it out, let me just give you some sense of where we'll be going, what we'll be covering. That was just, by the way, the introduction of the sort. So we'll be talking, I'll start out with an overview of some of the key concepts here. Indigenous territories, isolation, there's several of them that we'll touch on because they're the essential language of the research that we'll be doing. After that, we'll talk about the structure of research design. And in particular, I'll touch on hypotheses. This is a very hypothesis-intensive project. So we won't be touching on all of them. I'll just give you a sense of what they are. We have 3 hypothesis sets that I'll be broaching, if somewhat superficially. Of course, they go to the social sciences on one side and to the ecological environmental sciences on the other. I think it's worth saying that this is, I would call it an interdisciplinary project. So I would be considered, I believe, an interdisciplinary scientist. And maybe for the past 30 years, I don't know, people have been talking about interdisciplinary science, interdisciplinary research, interdisciplinarity, all kinds of interdisciplinarities out there. My experience has largely been that people who are interdisciplinary oftentimes have their own disciplines. They're on an interdisciplinary project, which means they go sit down with people from other disciplines and they basically have a conversation from their own disciplinary perspectives. And that's about it. You know, I would say maybe this is a bold claim that in this project, we've managed to somehow meld some of the disciplines into integrated sorts of questions. Now, maybe that's a bold claim. I don't know, but I'd like to think that's one of the reasons that NSF smiled upon the project. So with that in mind, let me go ahead and tell you where the project is. So most of my work has been in the Brazilian Amazon, more recently in Mexico. And so the Brazilian Amazon is pretty big. This project is in Ecuador. Ecuador is just over there, tucked in on the Pacific coast. And part of it intrudes into the Amazon basin. So the basin is given as that aqua colored line. The place we're working, and I hope this shows it, okay, kind of does, but this up in here is Colombia. So we're in a region called the Cumbios, and we're working with groups, 3 nations, the Kofan, the Siana, and the Sakope, and we work along a fairly long transect along the Aguarico River, which runs in through here and is affluent with the Napo River. And so the territories where we work with are strung out along, fairly long transect of the river, of course, the Aguarico. And let's see, it's always a surprise what's coming next. And I believe Joel will give us a few words about project motivation, if you're still there, Joel.
Yeah, I'm still here. Thanks, Bob. And hi, everybody. So jumping in really quickly and building off of what Bob was just talking about, the project responds to several different issues, and one of which is kind of captured by this image in the background of the slide here. And if you're paying attention, this image also appeared on the title slide. And so what you're seeing here on the right-hand side of the slide is a palm oil plantation, and on the left-hand side of the slide is yet uncut forest. And so we're looking at, of course, we're motivated by an area of extreme and rapid ecological change, but it also has very significant social impacts as well. And this kind of resonates with, can you click the button real quick, Bob?
Sure. Yep.
This resonates with work that,
Wrong direction.
No worries.
This is working. Oh, okay.
There we go. This resonates with work that Bob has been doing for quite some time on the tipping point that Carlos Nobre and other scientists have been doing on the question of a tipping point that really draws our attention to the significance of ecological change taking place in the Amazon basin itself, and the microcosm of which the Ecuadorian Amazon represents within that broader spectrum of change. And so I also highlight this little headline from the New York Times here, which really is also bringing what was once kind of like an esoteric concern to the foreground, which is the fact that, the Amazon is changing very rapidly. And so we're very interested as well in understanding different conservation efforts, particularly those of indigenous peoples on the front lines of these changes. So if you look at the other picture inset on the right there, it's a picture of a sign at the Secopai territory just as you enter, and it's really announcing, not only the prohibition of the entry of people not affiliated with the community or the nation, but also represents the indigenous territorial rights. And that's another thing that motivates this project, is thinking about the relationship between conservation and indigenous rights and indigenous self-determination, and how we might use the research process itself and the data that derives from it to support indigenous territorial management practices and to show their efficacy at conservation outcomes. And so looking at responses to this extreme ecological change, but also thinking about the ways in which we can use this sort of science and scientific method to support indigenous territorial rights and their effects on positive conservation outcomes.
Thank you, Joel. So motivation, moving from motivation into some of the key concepts en route to superficial discussion, I'd like to say again, of hypotheses. Now, I think this is the first time I've ever written a proposal or had a project that really originated just almost spontaneously from a geographic concept. And, we can go back to classic authors such as Doreen Massey to get at this. And this is what I think fit us into the DESIS program quite well. It was the concept of the indigenous territory, which we took to be our integrated socio-environmental system. And the idea is that the territory comprises, not just, Cartesian physical mathematical principles, but the cultural artifacts that are coterminous with the particular place in space. Could be an indigenous reserve, for example. And so the territory, in this case, we viewed as being the sum total of the ecological components with the human, behavioral, and institutional components. Now, the basic idea that we had here was that the territory exists in a type of equilibrium. It can be in a disequilibrium as well, but when all is well and good, it's a type of equilibrium in which forces are balanced, forces being forces of destruction or disintegrating forces and forces of integration, generative forces. And so long as these are integrated well and functioning well, the system can maintain itself in relative harmony ad infinitum, can achieve a state of sustainability. Now, what happens as this particular system or territory comes under threat is that it begins to disarticulate the constitutive elements of it, the environmental system and the human system. And over time, if the threats are too great, it can completely decompose. And so those different types of processes are represented here in the figure. On the far left, in the upper panel, we have an integrated system. As we move to the right, the system becomes increasingly subject to threat and eventually decomposes. And it turns out that this part of the world is a pretty good place to look at these sorts of dynamics because disintegrating forces are quite powerful. We just got out of the field, a town called Shushufindy, and our hotel was literally right on the border of a gigantic petrochemical complex. I mean, this is out pretty far in what once upon a time, maybe 20 years ago, was primary forest. So these sorts of forces are very, very pronounced and very strong in this part of the world. By the same token, we have integrating forces. I mean, the most obvious ones in this case would be the political mobilizing forces that oftentimes arise endogenously from the movements of the indigenous peoples themselves. So it's the balance of these two forces, oftentimes in opposition, which will determine the state of the system. And hopefully, well, for those who are concerned about the territorial rights of indigenous peoples, the integrating forces are going to prevail, and the disintegrating forces will be kept in check. Of course, we know from history that the history of the indigenous history on a global scale, and in this part of the world in particular, has really been a history of disintegrating forces. It's been a history of the destruction of indigenous cultures. And so we're at a moment in time where there are still many that are intact, which is one of the reasons we're happy to have a chance to do this work. So I've already touched on this a bit, the disintegrating forces in the case of Eastern Ecuadorian Amazon. It is a place of extreme resource exploitation at the moment. There has been a long history, it's relative terms, past couple of decades of colonization, but it's really been oil, petroleum resources, and of late, there's been a real expansion of agricultural activities, in particular palm plantations. And we saw those in the opening slide, and Joel talked about them, if briefly, when he discussed motivations here. The integrating forces I mentioned, political action, indigenous resistance, local institutions. I have in parentheses here something called biocultural, touch on that momentarily. And then it can't be understated the role of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, which are oftentimes of an international scope and can be very supportive of indigenous movements. Constitutional law as well. So we see this in Ecuador. We saw it in Brazil, where indigenous rights get embedded in constitutional amendments or actually in the drafting of new constitutions. Not that constitutional law is always followed, but at least it's there rhetorically. So those are the disintegrating and integrating forces. With respect to some of the other important concepts that we're working with, biocultural heritage. Now, what we mean by this, University of Florida is a good place to be exposed to this. If you go over to the center and sit in on any trophy lunch or talk to people in the TCD, the Tropical Conservation Development Program, there's a lot of talk of indigenous knowledge and highly specialized knowledge of ecological processes in tropical areas. Oftentimes, indigenous peoples have much better insight into it than even tropical ecologists. And it's on the basis of this kind of knowledge that responses can be made to changes of state in the ecosystem or in the human system adaptation and regulation, local institutions to manage the use of resources will be a part of the biocultural heritage. If you look at the languages that are spoken in this part of the world in particular, a huge percent of the language deals specifically with the environment. So, you know, there may be 30 different kinds of words for the same plant in a different part of the year or whatever. It's a very complex knowledge base. So that's biocultural heritage. Have here resilience and sustainability. Once again, these are key concepts that you hear a lot of in the University of Florida, tropical conservation and development, adaptation to changing environments, a very important thing in the Amazon basin at the present time. Sustainability. Sustainability, of course, is the holy grail in many respects. We always hope that we will achieve sustainable relations with the environment, whether we're in Florida or in the Amazon basin. And it turns out in this particular place and also in our project, one whole hypothesis that is aimed directly at sustainability and the circumstances, the conditions under which it can be achieved. And finally, isolation, ecosystem services. Ecosystem services, once again, is a very, I mean, it's one of these terms that, you know, it's the bread and butter of certain departments here on campus. In fact, the whole concept, I would say, originates here with an ecologist named Howard Odom, who was in the environmental engineering department for many, many years. The idea that much of what we consume or what we, in whatever way, services or goods, has ultimately its basis in the environment in some way or another. Ecological processes. Isolation, another important concept here. It's a landscape concept, comes to us from landscape ecology. And the idea is straightforward. If you have an indigenous reserve that's in a natural state, and I really hate to use contested language here, and maybe in this group it's not that contested to say there's such a thing as nature, but if we imagine that there is, you know, a primary ecosystem or old growth forest, and we have a reserve that's relatively close to it, and there's no barrier, you know, there's no, you know, strip mall, then we have no isolation. That's what we say. We say that, you know, the indigenous territory is not isolated from the natural system. It's embedded completely within it. Whereas if we have an indigenous territory and it becomes surrounded by, say, a palm plantation, or it becomes surrounded by urban land use or pastures, we say the system, the indigenous territory is isolated. And there are degrees of isolation. You know, you could have a situation where the palm plantation surrounds only a semicircle of the indigenous reserve, in which case part of it may not be isolated. Different kinds of land use will have different degrees of isolation. Parking lot, for example, imposes a great deal of isolation on a natural area. It could be a huge barrier. Whereas, you know, maybe a palm plantation for certain species in particular may not be so isolating, say, for example, with deer populations. But this is very important. This will be one of the factors that we look at. It's a major factor in explaining disintegrating forces in the region. So, okay, don't worry. I'm not going to go through this. Okay, I just want to put it up there. This is what was the table in our proposal, just to show you how schematic we were and comprehensive in laying out our hypothetical foundation. So hypothesis sets, they go to the nature, in particular, of disintegrating forces. They go to resilience, okay, which is going to be an attribute of the human component of the system, the social system. It's resilience typically to change of some type. What does it do? What kind of adaptive response will it have? And then sustainability, okay, will be the third hypothesis set. And so for each of these, of course, we'll have data needs, activities for collection, and modes of analysis for assessing hypotheses. So that's, please don't ask any questions about it. Okay. But you can ask questions momentarily about this one, because Cynthia Simmons is on the spot here.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
It's the same hypothesis set, but from the social science end.
Yes. So I do believe, and I think my colleagues do as well in this project, that this truly is an interdisciplinary effort, both in terms of the theoretical, areas and focus that has informed our hypotheses, as well as the data that we need to use to answer them, and the methodologies that we're going to employ. And I'm going to touch just briefly on the social science side of it. As you see, hypothesis 1 is looking at the correlation between isolation and the integrity of BCH and ecosystem service. And so it integrates both what's going to be detailed in terms of isolation from the ecology side of things with the integrity of the BCH, which getting at BCH is in fact a very important component of the social sciences. And we're also looking at hypothesis 2, which assesses the mechanisms of IT resilience when faced with environmental or disruption or disturbances. So what are the mechanisms that Indigenous communities use in response to disturbance in order to keep some form of resilience? Hypothesis 3 is looking at a range of environmental disturbances over different communities and whether they can maintain their provisioning. This is more, I think, for the most part, more on the ecological side. So I'm going to talk just briefly about these first 2 hypotheses. These 3 hypotheses, under each one, we have a subset of hypotheses. Now, I'm not going to go through the subset of hypotheses, otherwise we'd be here for a while. So I'm going to focus really on the first 2. Okay, so just kind of going back to this initial slide, this figure. Now, one important piece of the social science is really get at the indicators. Well, what is BCH? How is it manifested? What are the various indicators? So some examples, Indigenous knowledge. What is the degree of Indigenous knowledge? What types of rituals or practices do they perform? And this is really in terms of the resource base. What types of regulations are there in these different communities? And we're also interested in changes in BCH. What may be an indicator that BCH is affected by changes to come? So moving from like that, one where you have on the very top, totally integrated, where BCH is strong and they're very much dependent on the environment, to the last, ultimately, when they are pretty much separate with the biocultural and the system. In terms of changes, some of the things we want to look at, example change, one indicator would be food provisioning. How much are the communities reliant on market goods and services as opposed to being reliant on resources from the IT? How much are they involved in purchasing goods, involved in labor? And so we need to collect this data as well in order to get at indicators of BCH change. In terms of the second hypothesis, like I said, we want to assess the mechanisms of IT resilience. And here, when we're talking about resilience, we are talking about the resilience of the IT. And our primary hypothesis is that the Indigenous communities, when they're faced with potentially disturbance of food provisioning availability on their IT, that they adapt and they modify their BCH or their regulations to try to bring it back into balance. However, at some point, if in fact the disturbance is too great that they can't provision from the IT, then they have to make a choice. They either stay and they migrate, they stay and they start being involved in other activities, or they need to choose whether they leave. And then when they leave, what's the choice of their destination for water? So, as I said, the first option and the first hypothesis is that, in fact, they modify their BCH and they stay versus leaving, migrating elsewhere. And so, in this second hypothesis, what we're looking at is a framework. We're borrowing from the mobility studies. Why do they move? Where do they move? And really, we're looking at push and pull factors. Push factors, a degradation of food availability on the IT, the Indigenous territory. And so that may push them to go elsewhere. May also be overcrowding as colonists and others migrate into or nearby the community. They may decide that that's just too much and they're going to leave and go elsewhere. There could also be interpersonal conflicts. You got the push factors that informs their destination, as well as the pull factors. They're going to some of the extractive forms of territories, going to the cities. It may be availability of foreign goods as a pull factor, education, health services, as well as access to different markets. They may be pulled based on, going to another community that has maintained their BCH. And so, there's much talk and there's many theories about issues with Indigenous peoples and traditional peoples, that the bright lights big city is so much that it just pulls them to the cities. Not always the case. And we actually see some communities, especially in this particular territory, that have gone out of their way to stay further away from those communities. One of those communities being the Kofan in Zabalo. They left one area because it was being degraded, and they went to another area further into the forest, further into an area where they actually had access to the resources, and they modified their BCH, their biocultural heritage, to strengthen their ability to maintain their Indigenous territory. So we need to collect data on that as well. And so in this research, we have several different methods of collecting this data. We would first key informant interviews, and these have already been conducted. Key informant interviews, trying to understand, what are the different measures or indicators of biocultural heritage in each community. And these are from, the people involved in these key informant interviews are in fact the shamans, the leaders in these communities. And so they're informing us and the research about what we're going to actually use for our household surveys. And so this isn't going the way it's supposed to, so maybe I won't. Let me go back. Yeah, some of the stuff's not showing up. So the key informant interviews have already been done, as well as a big workshop. And the idea here is working with and collaborating with the Indigenous communities to, in fact, create the household surveys. And so the key informant interviews, there was a sample of about 60 that we were shooting for, and had the workshop. This informed the surveys. We have about, I think it's 4 Indigenous territories. Within those territories, there's different communities. We brought on several new Indigenous communities, and so the exact number, whether it's 6 or 8. With the household surveys, we will, like I had mentioned, we're going to look at different measures of biocultural heritage, what types of regulations they have in places, rituals and practices, their involvement with markets, whether they provision food for markets, sell their labor. There are different types of activities. And so with the surveys, we're shooting for a sample of 200. And then the last component is a Q-sort methodology. And here it's another collection of data in different households. And the idea here is to try to understand some other reasons or factors that influence their decisions, their choices to migrate, not to migrate, their involvement in labor or other types of market activities. And so like I said, there's 3 different primary components on the social science side. And this data will be used both qualitatively, trying to look at the various themes of importance using in vivo and other types of software. It also will be used in the statistical modeling. And so we have qualitative data we'll use in quantitative ways and such. So in terms of how it's actually happening on the ground in the field, we have Joel Correa is going to talk to that. Do you need me to hit the slides, Joel?
Please, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
So building from what Cynthia and Bob have been discussing about the research design and how we're bridging social and ecological data together through the different kinds of field methods that we're using and employing within the study, I wanted to build from that and talk about not only some of the ways in which we're doing the work on the ground, but also the guiding kind of research ethics and approach that we are using to do that work. And as has been mentioned, our approach is really based on collaborative research with Indigenous advisors from the communities where we're working, and a team of Indigenous research technicians who are helping to conduct the work. And so this really actually is an approach that is also very much rooted in the social sciences, but also the ecological science facets of this work. We're working with and training Indigenous research technicians in all of the communities where we're working. Those folks are helping us do everything from establish like camera trapping and transects to do ecological monitoring and biological monitoring of animal species, but also helping in the survey design and survey questions, survey translations. In the image here, you see at a small working group that we had in January working on finalizing some of our survey work and just like dialing in the questions alongside with community members to really like find out if not only the questions make sense, but also to recheck and kind of assess our design and assumptions throughout the whole process, and ensuring that we're also responding to community interest to some degree with regard to the types of questions and data that's being generated. We'll go to the next slide, please. This is really based on a long-term process of consultation and partnership. So Bob had mentioned in the introduction as well that this project really stems from a lot of relationships and long-term work that KOPI Michael Esbach has been doing in the northern Ecuador and the Ecuadorian Amazon. And it really stems from a lot of those relationships and new relationships that are coming through that process. And so what we've had then are a series of workshops in each of the communities and territories across the entirety of the field research sites to gain feedback on the process itself, to talk about the research design, to talk about the different kind of facets of actually doing this work. And it's a highly complex and very time-consuming and somewhat challenging process to work through, because we're working at different temporalities and rhythms of working through and with community consultation processes to gather, or rather I should say to come to collective understandings about the intent and purpose of the research, to ensure that communities that have been invited to join this work are interested in it and that they understand the processes. And this often requires many, many meetings. This isn't just we show up one time and do one meeting and then leave and come back and do the work. It's actually a very iterative and long-term process that generally takes place over the course of several months. And through these different meetings as well, communities themselves are identifying the people who will be working on the project from the community. So the Indigenous research technicians will be trained and paid through this project to do things like ecological surveys and assays, to do things like conduct the actual surveys, to do things like help us when we get to the point to do the key informant interviews and Q sorts. Those are all kind of elements of this long-term consultation and partnership. That's a continual process. And so we're always returning, and in that returning process as well, returning information and feedback from what has happened in the research process to date. So it's a very kind of engaged process that is rooted very much in community partnerships. And we'll go to the next slide, please. And that brings us back to this process that I was just talking about, which is a very much an iterative research process. So we started off with general research questions. Those are informed by not only the literature and the key pressing empirical problems, but also the deep research experience that Michael Esbach had in the area. So we, as the PI team worked together and thought about this process, we came up with the key research questions. Then, of course, we took those questions and we have been working with and through Indigenous advisory councils in each of the nations and communities that we're working. As you saw in the previous pictures, there are workshop feedback and opportunities. So where we share the research questions, share the methods that will be used to derive those questions or to answer those questions, derive the data to answer them, and then gain feedback about how that should actually be done, if it should be done, in what way it should be done. And that goes then into feeding into working with and training Indigenous research technicians who are collaborating with regularly with the PIs. I should also mention that in addition to Indigenous research technicians that we're working with in Ecuador, we also have some fantastic and phenomenal biological scientists and other scientists like Carlos Urgiles, who is working on the project and really helping out facilitate and work through several facets of this process, and including the consultation process and work with communities. And that brings us back to this question of research questions. So I could just give a quick example. This process worked really well with regard to starting with the camera traps. We talked about the research questions that would be answered through the camera traps, met with community advisory councils to discuss how, where, and if we could do those camera trappings. Then we trained technicians to do that work and help set up the camera traps, monitor the camera traps, gather the data from the camera traps. And that brings us back to the research questions, where we're then looking at the data from the camera traps, understanding how those tie into transects, And that whole process actually comes back and informs our social science methods as well, because we're using a lot of the biological and ecological science acquisition or data acquisition processes to continue building relationships and trust with communities, such that communities can understand the full complexity of this very academic project, but also that has real consequences for community members, to bring them in and involve them in meaningful ways within the social science facet of the project. And so you have these kinds of iterative processes where we'll go with the social science surveys, work through this process with them. That will inform what we'll ask in key informing interviews, which will then work through this process, and that will eventually inform what we'll ask in the Q-sort methods at the end of the process. So we can go to the next slide, please. And that brings us to I think, another facet of the work that I would say is relatively innovative with regard to large-scale interdisciplinary science projects and research projects, rather. And that is that this work is really based on a question of Indigenous data sovereignty as well. So we're working with and have co-created data sovereignty agreements with each community to ensure ethical data use per the community guidelines and decisions. The image that you see here is from the community Sinangwe. And the mural says, "Our territory, our decision." This really, to me, this image really captures a lot of the intent of the project, as well as to understand the ways in which we can use science to help communities defend their territorial rights, to help them make management decisions about how they want to use their territory sustainably into the future, and that they ultimately have the decision about how these processes will unfold and take place within their communities, which comes back to the ways in which both the social science and the ecological science facets of the projects are taking place, giving people and ensuring that communities have sovereignty over the data themselves and how that data is actually used and represented during and after the project. So I think from here we can bridge, Bob, and move back into a discussion of some of the camera traps and ecological monitoring facets, bridging from the social sciences back into the ecological.
So you're doing this?
I think.
Okay, I'm gonna sit down.
Okay. I haven't seen this slide, but
I can jump in and help. I've seen the
No,
next
that's okay.
slides. Okay.
We'll ride this wave. Hold on a second. I think we're getting to the camera trap stuff, right?
Yes, cameras and
Oh,
transect.
yeah. Oh, no? Okay. Anyway, so let me just give you, just a brief overview of what we're doing. Camera traps run 24/7 essentially. On the left side here, these are all locations where we put up the camera traps. And so these give us not so much counts, but information on presence of particular species. Over here, it's difficult to see, but there are little red lines that come out, and they come out somewhat systematically. It's hard to do this with a perfect geometry, but these are transects that people walk. And the data that's collected here is what's called density data. So this gives us insight into the actual populations of the different species. And it also gives us a very important measure, which is detectability, the probability that you will actually be able to detect particular species at some distance from which you view it. So here we have, can't see it, but right here is a camera trap. And these are some very happy people because they just finished putting all these in. Here we have a very happy Carlos and Michael Esbach, although you wouldn't recognize him now because he shaved his beard. But this is marking a tree, which is part of a transect. And this is actually, I believe this is the Nangoe. This is how we get around. That's one of the boats that we use. So this is some of the data acquisition. And I believe, I got my fingers crossed that you're going to see some of the information. Nope, but it's the same thing. Okay, we're getting there. So this is Fiona camera trap information. You can imagine, I mean, this was put out at great spiritual and physical expense, getting that stuff out there. Once again, we've got transects running on this side of the Aguarico River, on the other side. And here you see the encroachment of a palm plantation. Once again, happy people with the camera traps, happy people with the transect markers. And Joel has a huge smile here. I think it was a really bad day. I remember that day. I didn't go. I sat around and read a book. And then this is just one of the wide open plazas of one of the indigenous communities. And okay, Sikopai, one of the other, the third nation we're working with, camera traps, okay, and transects, the same sort of routine here, picturesque aspect of putting this stuff out. So this, just to give you some sense of where we're at, the camera traps have all been put in place. The transects have, for the most part, all been put in place. So we're a year and a half into the project. We've just started the social science data part of it with the questionnaires have been developed, and we're in the training phase and the very beginning of data collection. There's only one thing I really don't like about social science research, and that's getting clearance to do it. It took us over a year to get the approvals from Human Subjects Board here at University of Florida. So, words of the wise, it can be difficult, but it pays off in the end. And Kofan Zabalo, this is one of the other nations. So Kofan, we have two of their indigenous territories, one that's part of the West and one that's far to the East. Camera traps and the transects. This is the most pristine of the indigenous territories that we're working with. So that stuff is all in play. And so, hey, Joel, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. And so part of like using
Just a question. So the transects, we actually have the videos. Do they come after this, or I'm not sure where they are?
yeah, we will have videos that come immediately after this slide right here.
Okay, then, yeah, go for it. Okay.
Sure. So part of that iterative process that I was discussing earlier with regard to our research design and how we're actually like carrying out the work with partners in the field is a constant process of communicating our results and sharing back different facets of the work and what's taking place. You could call that science communication. You could just also call it just being transparent about what kind of work you're doing. I mean, so some of the folks from every community that we're working in are directly involved in the projects. For example, they're the ones that are helping go out and walk transects regularly, or they're the ones that are helping go out and maintaining and watching over camera traps, or there are a few people who are doing actual survey work themselves. Those individuals have great knowledge of the project because they're deeply involved in it, and other community members have varying levels of understanding about the project. Ostensibly, folks have heard through community meetings that they've participated in and other conversations about the work and what's going on, but some of the communities have quite a lot of people. So we're also working in communities to communicate regularly the results and kind of outputs of different phases of the project. And one part of that was sharing it's regularly sharing the feedback and results from camera traps that have been established in communities in their territories to show the kind of abundance and prevalence of different kinds of species that we were able to find and track, and to use that kind of information not only as a way to be transparent about the process, but to, you know, people are interested, they're excited. Some folks don't really know what's out there. Some people do have an intimate familiarity. And so it's a great way of building relations, building trust, maintaining transparency and communication with communities throughout that process. And when I'm talking about science communication here, I'm also being very specific about communicating the science and the process within the communities where we're working. I'm not talking about the different facets of science communication that we'll do at different parts of the project, from publications and presentations and that kind of thing, but it's really about an ethic of maintaining that constant relation with community members through sharing feedback. And some of the images which come up in the next slide, we can see some of the kind of just a couple quick videos that came from some of the camera traps in Sekopai territories. So there's hundreds of thousands of images across all of the camera traps that have been established across all of these territories. Each territory, so in the 4 different sites, you can click to the next slide, please. There'll be 4 different videos. So across all of these, across the 4 different territories, there were 30 camera traps established in each of those territories, each set up for a range of 3 to 4 months across a shoulder season that really hit between the wet and the dry season. So we're capturing quite a bit of imagery, of videos. We're still in the very initial phases of cleaning up that data and assessing that data. So we don't have anything firm to say about that yet, but it's been really fun to look at the products of the camera trapping so far, and also been a great way to do outreach with communities to show them what's present and what's not present. one thing that Carlos and Michael did, which I thought was fantastic in the communities, was to ask people like, is this animal present? Is it not present? And some folks would say yes, and some people would say no. And then we'd show some of the results of what was found on the camera trapping. And it's just a great way to keep people involved, engaged, and to communicate the kind of the ecological end of the research with community members, and also to get people interested in some of the other facets of the work that we're doing. And so that's kind of where we're at with that, Bob. And I think that's the last slide there.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much. Do I have any time left? Okay. So, yeah, I need 15, but I'll be. Okay, data integration. So we talked about, you've seen various parts of it, and bringing it together, I thought it would be worthwhile to end on hypothesis set 3, which is aimed at sustainability. And what this really is how is it that indigenous territories are able to harvest renewable resources over the long run? So this turns out to be a key policy question. And you can pose it as, under what conditions are indigenous people biodiversity stewards? And that is a really big question. And, this particular hypothesis set is one that I think, the approach to answering and imposing the hypotheses may be the best illustration of how the different disciplines come together to help us gain insight into certain outstanding questions. And so, one thing that I'm missing a slide, but I'll improvise on this. So community survival, it's hard to do a PowerPoint presentation from 3 different geographic locations within 2 days. But anyway, so the community survival algorithm, what is it about sustainability? What does it mean? All of us have a survival algorithm, okay? We have to produce what we require in order to survive. Now, in a market economy, that can be pretty complex because there are a lot of things that we consume. In an indigenous community, this boils down to a pretty simple equation. Are you providing or producing or harvesting enough food or enough renewable resources in order to meet the needs that you would have? And so, in what the comments I want to make, I'd like to make it very simple. Think about one particular natural renewable resource product, which would be food, okay, produced by ecosystem services, the biotic potential of the ecosystem. Okay, I'd like to think about just a single time period, okay? And also it facilitates, without a loss of generality, to think about just one particular species, although I can't remember the number of species that are actually taken out there and harvested, but there are a lot. So what a community has to do, as I say, is produce enough food over a period of time to meet the requirements of that community for that same period of time. It's quite simple. We can think of it, and I have the notation here. The F subscript T would be the production from an entire territory of some kind of protein or calorie, if you will. And then the RT would be the actual requirement of the community. And if you don't see it yet, maybe I'll go ahead and give you a hint here. Well, the metabolic requirements would be the type of information we would get from social science surveys in particular, whereas the amount of production that occurs, well, that's going to be a combination. It's going to involve data from the household surveys, from key informant interviews, but also from statistical analyses of certain characteristics of the environment. And I'll get into part of that, but not all of it. The way to look at it, and I'll say it verbally here, but then there's a figure that's coming up, is if you imagine that the territory, it has an extent of a certain number of square kilometers. It can be divided up into a set of smaller spaces, locations, collectively exhaustive, mutually exclusive locations for hunting, okay? And so hunting can occur on any one of these particular sites. And what you obtain off the individual sites, if you sum it all together, you will get the total production of the territory for some unit of time. Now, if we think of hunting as a discrete event, okay, with a certain outcome, a discrete outcome, binary outcome, you either get the animal or you don't, we're in a Bernoulli trial situation, okay? It's stochastic in that we don't know whether or not we're going to get the animal when we go out. And so this can all be, okay, I'm getting close, but suffice it to say, we're going to take all this stuff. We put it together. We have a model that enables us to map out the temporal trajectory of food production, okay, as a function of the environmental conditions in the reserve, including isolation, which is a condition that connects the reserve to the outside world, a function of hunting pressure, okay? And this gives us a probability of success at any particular point in time. It's a dynamic situation because the environmental covariates change with time. And it's because of that, we can map out in a Monte Carlo type of situation, what will be the production off the indigenous territory over time. And these are the slides that I will give next time I give it time. Okay.
But you have some results.
Yeah, right. There you go. Yeah, these are results. Anyway, we get and I'll just show you here. We have a way to map out the food production, if you will, or the ecosystem services production associated uniquely with any given indigenous reserve over time, and a way to compare that to the community requirements, and a set of hypotheses that go to telling us under what conditions we stay above that line, and what conditions by what conditions do we go below that line, which are the key policy questions. And so with that, and with the time constraint at the end, which is a tight one, I will thank you for your attendance and attention, and I'll open myself to questions and everybody else.
Yeah. Data sovereignty. Now, you live in a world of publication and increasingly higher pressure from funding agencies to make your data freely available. Indigenous people may have other ideas about what to do with their data. How do you handle that tension?
Well, the tension is handled by, and I think Joel brought it out quite effectively, by constant interaction and the building of trust. I mean, that's key. I mean, if anybody thinks you're going to come in there and rip them off, they're not going to work with you. I mean, it's that simple. If you build trust, and that trust is demonstrable, as for example, in co-authorship, then it becomes almost a moot issue. I'm not going to say it's moot, but you know, it can be handled. But it's very important to have those kinds of relationships. They will build trust, and so I mean the sovereignty is almost something that innately evolves under those circumstances.
It's also an agreement that NSF has with certain data probably won't be made available.
Right.
Because private data and data that the indigenous communities chose not to. So that's understood, and it is a challenge.
But yeah, as a program officer, you're right, because everything you produce has to be made available to the public right after a certain period of time. I mean, you know, you might say that there's kind of an intractable problem there, but you know, so far it hasn't been.
What's the motive for an indigenous person to be a co-author?
Well, the motive is, well, what are any of our motives? I mean, they don't necessarily
You get credit for it.
Well, it helps, you know, in the long run, jobs in the city, for example, if they like, relationships with other researchers. You know, there are paybacks, stature in the community.
And they have an interest in having to watch some of it.
Not only that, it turns out so we've had 3 field campaigns. They're incredibly interested in the information we're generating for the reasons that we're interested in, how to help defend their territories. And so they have a vested interest also in the information.
And how to prove to the governments that they can defend their territory is another.
So actually on that last point, I was really interested about this relationship between political action, resistance in the face of the disintegrating forces, and how that relates to the sort of BCH adaptation strategies you talked about, migration being one of them. Is that kind of resistance, that kind of political action, an adaptation strategy, or is it a different kind of category, or does that matter?
Well, I think it really matters. I mean, it kind of depends on your politics. I mean, some people would say, "Oh, just adapt. You know, don't fight the government. You know, go to Lima or go to Quito or go to Belém." Others would say, you know, dig the trenches and resist. And it's kind of I mean, they're two different political philosophies, and they aren't necessarily consistent with each other. Now, it's interesting because I'm quite familiar with one particular struggle, which is in the Tapajos watershed in the Amazon. And if you go one river over to the west, you're in the Madeira River, where there's an approach based on adaptive management, adaptive responses, work with the government, everything's cool. In the end, it'll be wonderful. Okay, big fantasy, I think. On the other side of the east, Xingu River, it was a little more contested, but it's gone through that sort of process, and there's a process of adaptation. Well, in the end, they lose their resources, I think personally, because, you know, in both cases, dams were built, which have essentially destroyed much of their territories. Now, the group in the Tapajos River is still in a resistance phase. And, you know, so far the government has not been successful in basically stealing their land. And so there's no way to really, you know, put them together and tie them up with a nice pink bow, I don't think.
I think that in terms of an adaptation, I mean, that is also, you know, resistance is their form of, you know, dealing with that adaptation, whether they decide to stay and, you know, resist, or they decide to migrate. But it really will depend on, you know, how things are in those communities and their choices.
We have time for one more question. I'm sorry, but it's quick.
Oh my gosh, these two, make them quick.
I absolutely love this entire presentation. Took me back to my old conservation days. Very unique. I just had a very quick question based on your community survival algorithm. Are you planning to carry out per species consumption, or why are you taking only cumulative animal count?
No, we're gonna take all the species. Well, it'll probably end up like, there's a board here that you have to, you know, get approval for all the animals they're gonna somehow be interacting with. That maybe 40 or 50, I don't know if Joel or Cynthia remember how many.
Yeah, I'm trying not to remember.
Yeah, I know, but there's only gonna be a few that are critical. And so we're gonna you know, do the best we can to get their full metabolic requirements. So maybe, you know, looking at 5 animals, so 5 species. Okay, sure.
Mine is just a simple question about the chimeras. So for the chimeras, what they put is quite a lot of information. So how are you planning to make sure that you make use of it? So you make use of all the information that you're capturing, because there'll be a lot of videos.
How are we gonna make it available?
No, not available, but how do you make sure that everything is more integrated into the search?
How do we make sure?
Yeah.
We don't.
I mean,
I mean, we do the best we can. Go ahead.
so there's a lot of data,
Yeah.
but they are going through and doing counts on those the data. I'm not sure the process that Michael's been doing with them.
They look at it and they, you know, first of all, the camera doesn't shoot, you know, 60 seconds per minute. It'll go on for, you know, it opens its lens or whatever every so often. So it's not necessarily like looking at a continuous stream over however many seconds in a day. But yeah, it's an exhaustive count as far as I know.